Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
My husband gave his mistress my wedding ring while I was in the hospital. She posted a photo on Instagram, a gift from my love. I just smiled. The next day, I did something he never expected. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I had the kind of marriage people envied, not in a showy way. We weren't the couple posting anniversary countdowns or matching Halloween costumes. We were steady. Garrett and I had been together for 11 years, married for 8. We had a house in Naperville, Illinois, with a backyard big enough for the garden I kept promising myself I'd actually tend to. We had a joint savings account with a respectable balance, 2 cars, a golden retriever named Chester, and the kind of comfortable routine that I, at 34, had mistaken for happiness. Garrett was a project manager at a mid-size logistics company downtown. I was a senior accountant at a firm in the Loop. We split the grocery runs, argued mildly about whose turn it was to call the plumber, and fell asleep most nights with the television still on. It wasn't electric, but it felt real. It felt ours. The first sign came 8 months before everything fell apart, though I didn't recognize it for what it was. Garrett started working late. Not occasionally, consistently. Tuesdays and Thursdays, then Wednesdays too. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening, reheating pasta for one, telling myself that promotions require sacrifice and that I should be supportive. I was supportive. I left plates wrapped in foil on the stove. I stopped asking what time he'd be home. Then came the phone. He'd always been relaxed about it, leaving it face up on the counter, forgetting it in the car. Suddenly, it was in his pocket every waking moment. He took it to the bathroom. He angled the screen away when I walked past. Once, I saw him smile at something on it and then immediately go blank when he noticed me watching. That smile. I cataloged it without meaning to. I told myself, "You're paranoid. You're tired. You've been stressed." And I had been stressed. In March, I was diagnosed with an ovarian cyst that required surgical removal. Nothing life-threatening. The doctor was clear about that, but it meant a week in the hospital, general anesthesia, and 6 weeks of recovery. Garrett drove me in. He held my hand while they prepped the IV. He kissed my forehead before they wheeled me back. He said, "I love you. I'll be right here." He was not right there when I woke up. The nurse told me he'd stepped out. A work emergency. He showed up 4 hours later with gas station flowers and an apology that felt rehearsed. I was groggy from the anesthesia. I let it go. For the next 5 days, he visited once in the morning, stayed 40 minutes, and left. My sister Dana drove up from Indianapolis and spent more time in that hospital room than my husband did. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I was healing. It was on the 4th night. Dana had gone back to the hotel. The ward was quiet. That I reached for my phone out of boredom and opened Instagram. I followed Tiffany Marsh because Garrett had introduced her at a company Christmas party 2 years earlier as a colleague. She was 27, pretty in a practiced way, with an account full of brunches and inspirational quotes. Her most recent post had gone up 3 hours ago. The photo showed her hand, manicured nails, rose gold ring, resting on what looked like a restaurant table. The caption read, "A gift from my favorite person. He knows exactly how to make me feel like everything." 46 likes, 12 comments, heart emojis. I zoomed in. I knew that ring. I had worn that ring for 8 years. The thin yellow gold band, the small round solitaire set slightly off-center. A flaw I'd always loved because it meant it was ours, not a catalog copy. I knew a scratch on the inside of the band from when I dropped it on the bathroom tile in 2019. I knew that ring the way you know your own face. It was my wedding ring. I set the phone down on the hospital blanket. The monitors beeped steadily. Down the hall, someone was laughing at a late-night talk show. I looked at my left hand, bare, because the nurses had asked me to remove my jewelry before surgery, and Garrett had offered to keep it safe. He had offered to keep it safe. I didn't cry, I didn't call him. I didn't call Dana or throw the phone or press the call button for the nurse. I just smiled, quietly, alone in that hospital room at 11:40 at night, with my abdomen still aching and my husband's girlfriend wearing my wedding ring on Instagram. I smiled because something shifted in me right then. Something that had been uncertain became absolutely, irreversibly certain. I knew exactly what I was going to do. They discharged me on a Friday morning. Garrett picked me up. He carried my bag to the car, opened the door, adjusted the seat so I could get in without straining my abdomen. He asked if I wanted to stop for coffee. He played the radio on low because he knew I got headaches after anesthesia. He was, in every visible way, a considerate husband. I watched him drive and thought, how long has he been practicing this? The house looked the same. Chester ran to greet me, tail destroying the air behind him. The dishes were done. There were fresh towels in the bathroom. Garrett had even put flowers, real ones this time, from a florist, in the vase on the kitchen table. Pink peonies. My favorite. Did he feel guilty? Or was this maintenance? Was this how he kept the machinery of our marriage running smoothly enough that I wouldn't look too closely underneath? I said thank you. I hugged the dog. I took my pain medication and went to lie down. And while Garrett made soup in the kitchen and the house smelled like something warm and domestic, I lay in our bed and stared at the ceiling and took a very slow, very deliberate inventory of my life. Assets. The house was in both our names. We'd bought it 6 years ago. I had contributed 60% of the down payment from an inheritance left by my grandmother. The joint savings account held just over $90,000. I had my own IRA, a 401k through my firm, and a small investment portfolio I'd opened before we married and never merged. My income was marginally higher than Garrett's. I'd always done our taxes, so I knew the numbers precisely. What I did not have, copies of recent bank statements, any documentation of his infidelity, or a lawyer. What I did have, time, and the particular sharpened focus that comes when grief bypasses weeping and goes directly to strategy. The fear came that night, real fear. Not of Garrett, but of the ground shifting. 11 years, the dog, the peonies, the life I thought I understood. I lay awake in the dark listening to him breathe beside me and felt the vertigo of realizing that the floor you've been standing on was never solid. That is its own kind of terror. Not a sudden shock, but a long, slow drop. But fear, I've learned, is only paralyzing when it has nowhere to go. By morning, I'd given it somewhere to go. Step 1. Documentation. I needed evidence before I moved a single visible piece on the board. The Instagram post was a start, but it was circumstantial. He could claim he'd found the ring, that it was a different ring. Anything. I needed more. I took a screenshot of Tiffany's post from an incognito browser on my personal laptop and saved it to a cloud folder I created with a new email address that had nothing to do with my name. Step 2. Financials. I needed to understand what had moved in our accounts while I was in the hospital. That week, under the cover of Getting Organized for Tax Season, entirely believable given my profession, I requested PDF copies of all our joint statements from the past 12 months. I did this from my work computer. I knew Garrett didn't monitor my work email. Step 3. Legal. I needed to understand my position before I made a single visible move. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, not 50-50. Assets are divided fairly, which means a good attorney matters enormously. I needed one before Garrett had any idea I was looking. I called Dana from the parking lot of a Walgreens on Tuesday, while Garrett thought I was picking up my prescription. "I need a family lawyer," I said. "Quietly, can you ask around?" There was a pause. Dana is not a dramatic person. She said, "How bad?" "Bad enough." "Okay," she said, "give me 2 days." She gave me a name by Thursday, Margaret Holloway, a family law attorney in Oak Park with 20 years of practice and a reputation for being precise and unsentimentally effective. I called and booked a consultation for the following Monday, listing it in my calendar as dentist. I was still recovering physically. My incision was healing. I moved carefully around our house, accepted Garrett's solicitous cups of tea, watched him scroll his phone with that private, angled focus, and said nothing. Every time I felt the grief rise, and it rose regularly without warning, while I was folding laundry or watching Chester sleep or remembering our first apartment, I let myself feel it for exactly 60 seconds, and then I put it somewhere it couldn't interfere with what I needed to do. I wasn't running on rage. Rage is loud and makes mistakes. I was running on something colder and much more reliable. Margaret Holloway's office was on the second floor of a narrow brick building on Lake Street in Oak Park, above a dry cleaner and an insurance agency. I'd expected something formal and intimidating. Instead, I found a compact woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up into short gray hair and a desk covered in color-coded folders. She shook my hand, poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, and said, "Tell me where you are." I told her everything. The Instagram photo, the ring, the absences, the hospital week, the financial picture as I understood it. I spoke for 20 minutes without interruption. Margaret took notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen moving in quick, economical strokes. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. Was there a prenuptial agreement? No. Were there children? No. Had I signed anything in the last 6 months? Refinancing, new accounts, any documents Garrett had brought home and asked me to sign quickly? I thought. There had been something in January. He'd said it was a routine update to our home insurance policy. I hadn't read it carefully. Margaret's expression didn't change, but she wrote that down with slightly more pressure. "Get me a copy," she said. She explained my position in flat, practical terms. Illinois equitable distribution would likely award me a significant share of marital assets, given my financial contribution to the home and my income history. The ring, if I could establish it, was marital property that he had removed and given to another person, was relevant. Not enormously so in the financial scheme of things, but useful as a demonstration of character and intent. "What I need from you," she said, "is documentation of the affair, if possible, and a complete picture of your joint finances. Every account, every asset, every debt. Can you get me that?" I told her I already had most of it. She looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "You've done this before." "I'm an accountant," I said. She almost smiled. "Good. Don't tell him you've been here. Don't change your behavior. Don't move any money. Don't confront him. Not yet." I drove home feeling, for the first time since the hospital, that I was standing on something solid. The financial records arrived in my work inbox that week. I spent 2 evenings going through them with the focused attention I normally reserved for audit preparation. What I found made my jaw tighten. In the 7 months prior, Garrett had made a series of cash withdrawals, never large enough individually to trigger a conversation, but cumulatively, $4,300. There were also 2 charges to a hotel in the West Loop that I did not recognize and had certainly not been present for. One was dated the Saturday I'd attended my college roommate's baby shower in Michigan. The other was dated the day I was admitted to the hospital. The day I was admitted to the hospital. I sat very still with that one. He had checked into a hotel with her while I was being prepped for surgery. While the nurse was drawing blood from my arm and asking me if I had any allergies and placing a hospital bracelet on my wrist, Garrett had been 3 miles away in a hotel room on the West Loop. I forwarded everything to a dedicated folder, printed nothing at home, and sent a password-protected copy to Margaret's secure client portal. The proof came from an unexpected direction. I had been careful with Tiffany's Instagram, viewing it only from incognito browsers, never from accounts linked to me. But I had not anticipated her becoming careless. 9 days after my discharge, she posted a second photo, a selfie, soft lighting, clearly a hotel room in the background. On the nightstand behind her, partially visible but unmistakable, was Garrett's watch. The Seiko he'd worn every day for 6 years, the one with the small chip on the bezel that I had noticed 1,000 times across 1,000 ordinary mornings. I screenshot it, saved it, sent it to Margaret. It was around this time that Garrett began to act differently, not dramatically. He wasn't the type for dramatic, but he started asking questions with a new texture to them. How are you feeling? Did you go anywhere today? Who were you on the phone with? Casual questions, delivered casually, but more frequent. He came home one evening and I noticed him glance at my laptop, closed on the kitchen table, and then away just a half-second too quickly. Had Tiffany seen something? Had she checked to see who'd been viewing her profile? Could Instagram show that? I went back and checked. Incognito browsing shouldn't have been traceable, but I'd grown up with a father who said if you think you haven't made a mistake, you just haven't found it yet. I became more careful, and I watched Garrett watch me. We were, by that point, 2 people moving through the same house on completely different trajectories, performing a marriage that had already ended. Only one of us knew it. Did he suspect? Or was this just guilt, manifesting as vigilance? It didn't matter. The point of no return had already passed. On the night I saw that photo in the hospital, in the quiet certainty of that smile, everything since had simply been preparation. Margaret called me on a Thursday. "I have enough to file," she said, "whenever you're ready." I told her to wait 1 more week. I had one remaining thing to put in place. The one remaining thing was the house, not the property itself. That would be settled in proceedings. What I needed was to ensure that I was not financially exposed if Garrett, upon receiving divorce papers, reacted by draining the joint account before a court could freeze assets. Margaret had warned me this was a common move. I did not move the money. She'd been explicit about that, as any unilateral transfer would harm my position in court. What I did was document its existence with a time-stamped bank statement, affidavit, and a request filed through Margaret's office for a temporary financial restraining order to be issued simultaneously with the divorce filing. It was a standard protective measure, perfectly legal, precisely timed. Margaret filed on a Tuesday morning in April. I was at work when it happened. I had chosen that deliberately. I wanted to be somewhere public, professional, surrounded by colleagues, when Garrett's phone rang with whatever notification the process server delivered. I sat at my desk in the Loop, reviewed a quarterly report, answered emails, and ate a container of yogurt from the office refrigerator. My hands were steady. Garrett called at 11:14 a.m. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 11:17 and 11:23. I silenced the phone, put it face down in my desk drawer, and finished the quarterly report. His voicemail said, voice controlled but strained at the edges, "Claire, call me. We need to talk about this. You need to call me." I texted Margaret, "He's been served." She replied, "Expected. Do not engage today. Let him absorb it." I drove home at 5:30. Garrett's car was in the driveway, which I had expected. I had also expected him to be angry. What I had not entirely prepared for was Tiffany Marsh sitting in my kitchen. She was at my kitchen table, in my house. Drinking, I noticed with a distant, almost clinical astonishment from one of my mugs. Garrett stood near the counter. He looked like a man who had been rehearsing something and lost his place. Tiffany spoke first. She was the kind of person who believed confidence was the same as power. "We need to clear some things up," she said, as if she had been invited, as if this were reasonable. I set my bag down on the counter. I looked at her hand. She was wearing my ring. She had, apparently, decided that showing up at my house while wearing my wedding ring was a reasonable course of action. "You're in my house," I said. "Garrett and I are together," she said. "We have been for over a year, and before you do something that ruins everyone's lives, you should hear his side." I looked at Garrett. He had the expression of a man who has made several consecutive bad decisions and is only now beginning to understand the arithmetic of that. "Claire," he started, "I should have told you. I know that, but you can't. The account freeze, the house. You're going to destroy everything we built." "You gave her my ring," I said, "while I was in the hospital." Silence. "The hotel on West Loop," I said, "the night I was admitted." Tiffany's composure flickered, just slightly. "The 4,300 in withdrawals," I said. "The January document you had me sign. Margaret's already looked at it, by the way. It's not going to do what you were hoping." Garrett's face went through several things in rapid succession. Then Tiffany leaned forward and her voice dropped to something that was trying to be intimidating. "You really want to go through the courts? Because Garrett has things he could say about you too. Your firm, your accounts. There are ways to make this very complicated for you professionally if you don't back down." There it was. I looked at her for a long moment. She held my gaze, and I could see that she believed this would work, that I would calculate the threat, find it sufficiently frightening, and fold. "Get out of my house," I said. "Both of you, tonight." "Claire, you'll receive correspondence through Margaret Holloway's office. Do not contact me directly. If either of you sets foot on this property again without legal authorization, I will call the police and file a harassment complaint." I picked up my phone. "I'm calling Dana now. She's going to stay here this week. I suggest you make other arrangements, Garrett." He left that night. He took a bag. Tiffany waited in her car. I stood in the kitchen after the door closed and listened to the house settle around me. Chester came and leaned against my leg. Outside, I heard a car start and pull away. I called Dana. She was there by 9 o'clock. I took 4 days. I slept. I let Dana feed me actual meals and watch terrible television with me, and take Chester for morning walks while I sat in the backyard in the early April cold with a blanket and a cup of coffee, and simply breathed. I let myself cry twice. Long, thorough cries that I'd been holding in a controlled compartment for weeks. And then I put my cup down, went back inside, and got back to work. The attempts began the second week. Garrett had clearly decided that anger hadn't worked and was now cycling through his other available tools. The first text arrived on a Wednesday evening, long and carefully written. I could tell he'd revised it several times. He talked about 11 years. He talked about what we'd built. He said he'd made a catastrophic mistake, that he was in something he didn't know how to get out of, that if I would just talk to him, person to person, without lawyers, he thought we could find our way back. He mentioned the backyard, the garden I'd never gotten around to planting. He said he'd been thinking about putting in raised beds this spring, the way I'd always wanted. I read it once. I forwarded it to Margaret. I did not reply. Was it manipulative? Almost certainly. Was some part of it true? Perhaps. Did it matter? By that point, I understood something important. The question was not whether Garrett felt genuine remorse. The question was whether his remorse changed the facts. It did not change the hotel receipt dated the night I went into surgery. It did not change the ring on Tiffany's hand. It did not change $4,300 and a document he'd slipped into a stack of papers for me to sign without reading. Remorse is not the same as accountability. I had learned that distinction at considerable personal cost, and I intended to keep it. The second attempt came through Sarah Kimball. Sarah was someone I'd considered a friend. We'd been in a book club together for 3 years. Our husbands had met at a company event. We grabbed coffee monthly. I should have anticipated this vector. In retrospect, the signs were there. Sarah and her husband Kevin moved in adjacent social circles to Garrett, and Kevin had always been the kind of man who believed conflicts were best resolved through back channels and male solidarity. Sarah texted asking if she could come by. I said yes because I genuinely believed she was coming as a friend. She came as a mediator. She sat across from me at the same kitchen table where Tiffany had sat the week before. The symmetry was not lost on me, and after 15 minutes of careful, gentle preamble, she said that she'd spoken with Garrett, that he was devastated, that Tiffany was really not what you're imagining. She's actually quite lost herself, and that she really thought if I could find it in me to consider counseling before going further down the legal road. I stopped her. "Sarah," I said, "did you know while it was happening?" She looked at the table. That was her answer. I nodded slowly. "I'd like you to leave," I said, "and I'd like you to tell whoever sent you that this approach isn't going to work either." She left looking troubled. I felt the sharp, specific loneliness of discovering that someone you'd counted as a friend had been on a different team the whole time. I sat with that for a while. I allowed it to be painful. But here is where something shifted in the other direction. I had mentioned to a colleague at work, Lisa, a litigator's wife who'd been through her own divorce 5 years prior, that I was going through a difficult personal situation. I hadn't given details, but Lisa had seen enough in her own life to read between lines, and on a Friday afternoon she appeared at my office door and said simply, "Do you want to have dinner?" No questions, no advice, just dinner. We went to a Thai place on Michigan Avenue. She did not ask questions. She told me about learning to reframe fear as information rather than obstacle. She told me about the specific grief of losing a version of your life you'd believed in. She told me about coming out the other side. Then, Through Lisa, I found a small divorce support group that met Tuesday evenings at a community center in Evanston. I went once, not sure I belonged there, and stayed for 2 hours. There were 7 women around a folding table in a room that smelled like coffee and institutional carpet, and they were, without exception, remarkable. A woman named Priya who'd found out about her husband's double life through a credit card statement. A woman named June, 62 years old, silver-haired, dry-humored, who said, "The best revenge is a competent lawyer and a good accountant, and you, honey, already have both." I laughed for the first time in weeks. The support wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. These women had navigated exactly what I was navigating. They knew which moves telegraphed desperation and which projected confidence. They knew what judges in Cook County tended to prioritize. They knew, from direct experience, that the side that stays calm and organized almost always outlasts the side that operates on adrenaline and panic. Garrett was operating on adrenaline and panic. I went home from Evanston on Tuesday nights feeling each time slightly more like myself. Through all of this, I maintained the same external life. I went to work, I walked Chester, I bought groceries. I responded to Garrett's legal communications exclusively through Margaret. I did not post anything personal on social media. I did not discuss the proceedings with mutual acquaintances. I watched Garrett through the peripheral awareness that 11 years of marriage gives you, grow increasingly unmoored by my silence. He had expected, I think, that I would be destroyed by this, that grief or anger would make me sloppy, that I would lash out in ways he could use or collapse in ways that would let him manage the situation on his terms. He had miscalculated who he was married to. They came on a Sunday. I'd been warned in an oblique way. Margaret had mentioned that Garrett's attorney, a man named Pressman, who had a reputation for preferring settlements over courtrooms, had reached out to her office to suggest an informal conversation between the parties. Margaret had advised me that I could decline, and that she would be present if I chose to proceed. I chose to proceed. I wanted to see what they had prepared. What they had prepared was a performance. Garrett arrived in the clothes he knew I associated with sincerity. A gray Henley I'd bought him 2 Christmases ago, dark jeans, no watch. He'd clearly thought about this. He looked tired in a way that was possibly genuine, and he held a bakery box from a place on Oak Park Avenue that we used to go to on Sunday mornings in the first years of our marriage. Inside, I knew without opening it, would be almond croissants. He had actually bought almond croissants. Tiffany was with him, which surprised me. I'd expected Garrett to come alone for this phase. She was dressed down in a way that was obviously intentional. Jeans, minimal makeup, hair pulled back. She was performing accessible. She was performing harmless. Margaret sat beside me at the dining room table. Pressman sat beside Garrett. Tiffany sat slightly apart, hands folded as though she were simply a concerned witness. Garrett spoke first. He'd prepared a speech. It was, I will admit, well constructed. He acknowledged failures. He used words like profound regret and accountability. He talked about therapy, about a willingness to make right whatever needed making right. He said he would not contest a fair settlement. He talked about Chester. He talked about our families, our shared history, the disruption to both our lives if this went to a full contested trial. Then Tiffany spoke. "I know this isn't my place," she began, in a voice calibrated to sound humble, "but I want you to know that I never wanted to hurt you." I didn't know at first that he was. She paused, managed something that might have been emotion. I was a victim of his dishonesty, too. I looked at her hand. She was not wearing the ring today. Someone had advised her to remove it for this meeting. I thought. She rehearsed the pause. Pressman then laid out what they were characterizing as a generous offer. Garrett would concede the house. He would agree to an equitable split of liquid assets. Though I noticed the number they proposed was based on a figure that did not match the statements I had already documented. He would waive any claims to my personal investment accounts. In exchange, I would agree to an expedited, uncontested divorce, no fault, with no further claims. It's a clean ending, Pressman said, for everyone. Margaret said nothing. She told me beforehand, let them finish. Don't respond immediately. The first person to fill silence usually has more to lose. I let the silence sit for about 10 seconds. Then I said, the asset figure you've cited is $32,000 less than the documented balance in our joint accounts as of the date of filing. I have statements. I'd like to understand that discrepancy before we discuss any settlement figure. Pressman blinked. Garrett's jaw moved slightly. Also, I said, I'm going to need the ring returned before any settlement conversation proceeds. It's marital property that was removed without my consent and given to a third party. That's documented. Tiffany's composure broke first. It was small, just a tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in her posture. But I saw it, and so did she, and she knew I saw it. This is exactly the problem, she said, and the calibrated humility was gone now, replaced with something sharper. You're not interested in resolution. You're interested in punishing him, punishing us. And a judge is going to see that. Tiffany. Pressman's voice was quiet and warning. No, honestly, she's going to drag this out for years over a ring, when she could walk away right now with the house and. Would you like to explain, I said, keeping my voice completely level, why you were in a hotel on the West Loop on the night I was admitted to the hospital? Because I have the receipt, and I'd be glad for that to be part of the court record. The room went very quiet. Garrett looked at the table. Tiffany looked at Garrett. Pressman looked at nothing. I think, Margaret said pleasantly, that we'll continue this through proper channels. They left. Tiffany went out the door without looking back. Garrett paused at the threshold and looked at me with something that I couldn't entirely categorize. Some mixture of regret and resentment, and something that might have been, underneath it all, a reluctant recognition. I closed the door. My hands were shaking. Not visibly. I'd held it together completely at the table. But once the door was closed and Margaret was packing her files and I was standing in the hallway alone, my hands shook. Real fear. Fear of the trial. Fear of Tiffany's threat about my firm. Fear of the months of exposure still ahead. Fear of all the ways this could still go badly. I stood there and let my hands shake. And then something hardened. The same thing that had hardened in the hospital room, but deeper now, reinforced by weeks of preparation and the specific fury of watching someone perform victimhood in my own dining room while wearing my ring on another day, on another hand, somewhere outside that room. Number, not out of rage, not out of bitterness, out of the very simple understanding that I had done nothing wrong. I had been wronged comprehensively. I had documented it. I had prepared, and I was not going to accept $32,000 less than what was mine to avoid the discomfort of being seen. The fear didn't disappear. It just stopped driving. I picked up my phone and called Margaret. "We're going to trial," I said. The trial date was set for the 3rd week of October. The months between the failed Sunday meeting and that date were not empty. They were a kind of sustained, quiet warfare, conducted entirely through documentation and procedure. Garrett's team filed several motions, attempting to challenge the asset freeze, questioning the relevance of the hotel receipts, characterizing my financial preparations as bad faith. Margaret countered each one with a precision that I, as an accountant, found genuinely satisfying to watch. The document I had signed in January turned out to be significant. It had been, as I'd suspected, an attempt to transfer partial ownership of a small piece of inherited personal property. A parcel of land in Kentucky left to me by my grandmother, valued at approximately $60,000, which Garrett had apparently intended to position as a marital asset. The transfer had not been properly executed, which meant it had no legal force, but it demonstrated intent clearly enough that Margaret incorporated it into the portrait she was building of Garrett's financial conduct over the preceding year. Tiffany was not a party to the divorce proceedings, but she had made herself material to them through her own social media and through 3 text exchanges that Garrett had inadvertently preserved by syncing his phone back up to a shared family cloud account he had forgotten to disconnect. I will be generous and call that an oversight on his part. Those texts establish the timeline of the relationship with uncomfortable specificity. I arrived at the courthouse on the morning of trial in a dark navy suit I had bought specifically for this occasion. Margaret had advised me, professional, composed, not severe. I had slept the night before. Not well, but I had slept, which I took as a sign that my body, at least, had accepted the situation. Garrett was there with Pressman. He looked like he had not slept. Tiffany was not present. I had half expected her. I had imagined some version of her in the gallery, watching. She had apparently been advised against it. The judge was a woman in her late 60s named the Honorable Patricia Whale, with a reputation Margaret had described as procedurally rigorous and personally unsentimental. Exactly right for our purposes. The morning session established the financial record. Margaret laid it out with the same clean methodology I'd used when I first sat with those bank statements. The documented asset balance at filing, the withdrawals, the hotel charges, the discrepancy between Garrett's proposed settlement figure and the actual account balance. Pressman objected repeatedly. Judge Whale sustained some, overruled more. When Garrett took the stand, I watched him with the particular attention of someone who has studied a subject for 11 years and can detect every microdeviation from baseline. He was composed at first. He answered Pressman's questions fluently, casting the marriage as mutually deteriorated and characterizing his actions as the product of emotional distance rather than deliberate deception. He was well prepared. Then Margaret stood up. She asked about the hotel on the West Loop. She asked specifically about the date. Did he recall what he was doing on the night of March 14th? He said he didn't recall specifically. She presented the hotel receipt. He said he recalled going for a work dinner, perhaps spending the night due to a late meeting. She asked whether the hotel room had been a single occupancy. He hesitated. She presented the text exchange from the cloud backup, which included, at 11:43 p.m. on the night of March 14th, a message from Garrett to Tiffany reading, "She's in surgery. I've got the room until morning." The courtroom was very quiet. Margaret gave that a moment. Then she moved on. She asked about the ring. He acknowledged he had taken it for safekeeping. She asked when he had given it to Tiffany Marsh. He said it had been a misunderstanding, that Tiffany had found it and worn it without his explicit. His voice developed a quality that I recognized as the sound of a story collapsing under its own weight. She presented the Instagram post. She presented his text, sent 2 days before the post, which read, "Wear the ring. You deserve something real." Pressman was on his feet. There were objections and rulings and procedural exchanges that I barely tracked because I was watching Garrett's face. He looked, at that moment, like a man who had built a structure without accounting for its foundations, and was watching it come down around him in real time. Margaret asked about the January document. She asked about the Kentucky property. She asked about the gap between the settlement figure Pressman had proposed and the documented account balance. By the time she finished, Pressman was asking for a recess. Judge Weil granted 15 minutes. I sat in the hallway on a wooden bench with a cup of courthouse coffee and Margaret beside me reviewing her notes. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. A sense of absolute clarity, the way the air feels after rain. This was the moment I'd been working toward since the night I lay in a hospital bed and smiled at my phone. When we returned, Pressman made one more attempt, questioning my financial behavior, suggesting I had been strategically managing information throughout the marriage. Margaret dismantled it in 4 minutes using my firm's employment records. 3 years of joint tax returns I had prepared and filed, and a statement from my employer confirming my professional reputation. Judge Weil looked at the room. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for closing arguments," she said. Her expression gave nothing away, but she looked, I thought, like a woman who had seen this before and knew exactly where it was going. I did too. Judge Weil delivered her ruling on a Thursday morning in late October. I sat in the same seat I'd occupied the day before and kept my hands still in my lap. Margaret sat beside me. Across the aisle, Garrett sat with Pressman, who had the carefully neutral expression of an attorney who already knows the outcome. The ruling was 12 pages. Judge Weil read the summary aloud. The marital home in Naperville was awarded to me. Given my 60% contribution to the down payment, my consistent financial management of the household, and Garrett's documented withdrawal of funds from joint accounts in the 12 months preceding the filing, the court found this disposition equitable. Garrett had 60 days to remove his belongings. The joint liquid assets were to be divided based on the documented balance at date of filing. The figure from my statements, not the figure Garrett's team had proposed. The $32,000 discrepancy was addressed directly. The court found evidence of deliberate misrepresentation in the settlement negotiation and awarded me an additional remedial amount to account for it. My personal investment accounts, opened prior to the marriage and maintained without commingling, were confirmed as separate property and excluded from division. The Kentucky land parcel, given the circumstances of the January document, was confirmed as my sole property. Garrett was ordered to pay a portion of my legal fees, not all of them, but a portion which Judge Weil noted was appropriate given the conduct documented in the proceedings. And then, at the end, in the section addressing personal property, the ring was to be returned to me within 30 days as marital property improperly transferred to a third party. If it was not returned in its original condition, Garrett would owe me its appraised value in damages. I heard Pressman exhale slowly beside Garrett. I heard Garrett say, very quietly, "Okay, just that. One word. I did not look at him. I looked at Judge Whale, who was gathering her papers with the efficient composure of someone who has delivered judgments like this more times than she can count, and I felt something release in my chest. Something that had been held at tension for 7 months. Outside the courthouse in the pale October sunlight on the wide steps, Margaret shook my hand. "Clean," she said, which was the highest compliment she offered. I nodded. I thanked her. I stood there in the sun for a moment after she walked back inside, just standing. Garrett did not speak to me as he left. He walked down the steps with Pressman, and they got into a car, and they drove away, and I watched until the car turned the corner and disappeared. Tiffany Marsh, I learned through channels I was not actively monitoring, had ended the relationship with Garrett approximately 3 weeks before the trial. Apparently, the reality of a contested divorce, with her name appearing in text messages and hotel receipts, and a very public Instagram post that had become evidence, had recalibrated her interest in the situation. She had, according to someone who told Dana, moved to Phoenix. I wished her nothing, which felt clean. The ring arrived by courier on the 28th day. It came in a small padded envelope with no note. I opened it at the kitchen table, Chester asleep on his bed in the corner, and I held it in my hand for a long time. The thin yellow gold, the small solitaire, slightly off-center, the scratch on the inside of the band from the bathroom tile in 2019. I did not put it on. I considered it for a while, then placed it in a small dish on the windowsill, where the morning light hit it at an angle that made it look like something more than it was. I would figure out later what to do with it. For now, it was enough that it was back where it belonged. I sat in the kitchen in the quiet of a late October afternoon in my house, in the life I had methodically, deliberately, without drama or self-destruction, reassembled into something that was entirely and unambiguously mine. Chester woke up, yawned enormously, and came to put his head on my knee. I scratched behind his ears. Outside, my yard was going gold with fall. 18 months later, I planted the garden. Not because I had time left over, but because I finally understood that making time for the things you've been promising yourself is itself a form of claiming your life back. I put in 3 raised beds along the south fence, tomatoes, herbs, a row of zucchini. I later regretted because apparently 1 zucchini plant is more than enough for a single woman and her dog. Chester developed a passionate and inexplicable relationship with the garden, which mostly meant I spent the first 2 weeks teaching him that raised beds were not for lying in. The house felt different. Not because I'd renovated, but because it was entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. I repainted the bedroom a deep sage green. I moved furniture I'd always wanted to move. I put a reading chair by the window that got afternoon light and actually used it. I got a promotion in the spring. Senior Director of Financial Operations, a title that came with a corner office and a salary that made my old financial anxiety feel like a story from another life. I celebrated with Dana and Lisa and June from the Tuesday group at a restaurant in the West Loop. We ordered the good champagne. June gave a toast that was equal parts funny and devastating and exactly right. I traveled. I went to Portugal for 2 weeks in the summer, something I'd brought up with Garrett 4 times and been talked out of each time. I walked through Lisbon in the long golden evenings, ate seafood, read on cafe terraces, and felt genuinely happy. Not performed happiness, not recovery happiness. The real, slightly surprising, somewhat ordinary kind. I started seeing someone in the fall, a structural engineer named David, patient and funny, who asked questions that expected real answers and never made me feel like my history was a liability. We took our time. As for the other side of that courtroom, Garrett was navigating the specific misery of someone who had gambled everything on a version of his life that hadn't materialized. He'd moved into a rental apartment, splitting costs with a roommate at 38, which he was apparently finding humbling. The financial division left him with less liquidity than expected. The legal fees had been substantial, and the trial's public record had created a professional awkwardness his manager wasn't going out of his way to resolve. I felt something more like of course than satisfaction. Consequence is not cruel, it is simply accurate. Tiffany had returned to Instagram after a 6-month absence with desert sunsets and motivational quotes. Rebranded as someone who had chosen herself, she'd begun a relationship with a man in Phoenix who was, Dana's sources reported, basically the same situation all over again. That phrase contained its own complete commentary. Some patterns don't break because of the wreckage they cause. They break only when the person carrying them decides to look at themselves honestly. I had done the looking. I'd looked at the parts of myself that had known something was wrong and stayed quiet out of fear. I'd looked at how I'd confused stability for happiness and routine for connection. The hardest part wasn't the depositions or the trial. It was sitting in my backyard in the November cold afterward and asking honestly, who do you want to be now? Not in reaction to what happened, who actually do you want to be? I was still working on the answer, but I was asking the question, which felt like the essential thing. The ring I eventually had remade, melted down, reformed into a simple wide band, no stone, smooth and plain. The jeweler asked what I wanted inscribed inside. Enough, I said. I wore it on my right hand. They thought my silence was weakness. They mistook my patience for helplessness and my calm for defeat. They were wrong. I learned this. Fear is information, not instruction. Grief is real, but it doesn't have to be the loudest thing in the room. And the most powerful thing you can do when someone underestimates you is let them keep underestimating you until the moment it costs them everything. If this had happened to you, if you woke up and found that the life you trusted had been built on a lie, what would you have done? If this story reached you, leave a comment. I read them. Thank you for staying with me until the end.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.